What if I told you the default authentication in Spring Security is not enough for real world applications? So imagine this, you join a fintech company and your technical architect says you need username password for admin, OAuth2 authentication for mobile, and Jazz authentication for your legacy systems. Now what? If you have only used the DAO authentication provider, you will be definitely going to stuck. Let's take another example. Your product manager walks in and says there must be new compliance rule needs to be implemented as part of the authentication. So what that is, users under 18 can't access certain services and we need to block login from restricted countries. So where do you write that particular logic inside your security? So inside user detail service, is it so? Not actually. So that's only for loading your data. So where do you even write this particular logic? So the real authentication decision happens somewhere else entirely inside the authentication provider. In this video, I'll show you exactly how Spring Security handles multiple authentication flows and when you need to build your own custom authentication provider. That's exactly where we are going to master in this video. By the end of this lecture, you will understand how Spring Security routes different authentication types to different authentication providers, when and why we need to write our own authentication provider, the full request flow from filters, provider manager, custom provider back to the user. And if you are following this series, you already know the user detail service and password encoder. So today we will just level up and let's go with our video. So the question is, why do we even need a custom authentication provider? So we have seen a TAO authentication provider does a fantastic job. It basically loads up your user details service implementation and handles the password comparison inside the password encoder seamlessly. Why we bother writing our own implementation? Because the real world enterprise application aren't simple. They are just messy, complex, and full of peculiar requirement. Let's just move to our next slide and see with a quick enterprise example. Imagine an enterprise that needs to support three different ways to authenticate user. So the requirement one is username and password. That basically is a traditional login for internal application. So the very first style is they want to allow the end user to log in with their username and password for certain application. So the second requirement is to accept OAuth 2 based authentication. This is a modern authentication for external facing applications. So they want to allow the authentication with the help of OAuth 2 framework. So OAuth 2 is a standard which we are going to discuss in the upcoming lectures. Then we have the requirement 3, which is a Jazz. This is a legacy application supported service. And similarly, the organization also have the requirement for certain application or to certain user to authenticate them using with the help of Jazz. So Jazz basically means your Java authentication and authorization service. So inside the Java library itself, we have a small security plugin, our authentication framework, which is provided by the Java team. Because these days everyone's favorite is Spring Security, but you may end up in some scenarios where a certain organization may want to support login into a legacy application with the help of this Jazz. So each of this style require its own implementation of authentication provider. So the another important question, how does provider manager knows which provider to call? So the type of authentication object that is creating after your security filter chain runs, the authentication object. So the type of authentication object is the key which is basically generated at the time of request coming into your actual system. So username password authentication token that we have seen, So it basically invokes the username and password provider. Then we have the OAuth2 authentication token. So basically it invokes the OAuth2 provider, and we have the JAS authentication token, which invokes the JAS provider. So the provider manager basically inspect the authentication object type and route it to the correct authentication provider automatically. So this is the basic idea of provider manager, which basically delegates the request to the authentication provider. So basically in this particular slide, we are seeing how the provider manager receives the request and delegates the request to the appropriate authentication provider implementation. So let's take an example where we have the first authentication provider, which is JAS. So when the object comes in, the authentication object is passed to the first authentication provider implementation. It checks whether it is an implementation of this particular. If not, the request goes to another authentication provider, which is OAuth2. And if it is able to handle this, if yes, it going to invoke the authentication method. If no, it then goes to the next authentication provider implementation, which is a username password authentication implementation. And if yes, if this particular class is going to implement that particular authentication object, then the authenticate method of this particular class will get executed, and the authentication will then after runs and do the appropriate authentication. So this is the basic sequential flow of authentication strategies. So this is the basic flow of hit and check whether the object fits into the correct implementation. If yes, then we are going to do the authentication. Next, this is also similar to the previous one. So here the request is coming from the user to our Spring Security filters. Now, Spring Security filter will create an authentication object which has the information of your implementation class. Now, this particular object goes to the provider manager. Provider manager basically delegates and check one by one who else is going to provide the authentication logic. It one by one checks to all authentication provider implementation if anyone is able to do the authentication. Here in the scenario, the username and password authentication flow is getting triggered, and via that, user detail service is getting invoked to fetch the user related information from the database, doing the password matching and returning the object to the user for their successful authentication. Let's try to understand a scenario where a custom authentication provider becomes necessary. So as of now, the default authentication provider is our DAO authentication provider. So it works like this. It relies on the user detail service. User details service. So in our case, we have created a custom implementation, which is our bank user details service. So inside this class, we define how user details are loaded from the database. So authentication flow works where the user details service loads user data from the storage system. DAO authentication provider uses the data, perform the password comparison with the password encoder, and basically makes the authentication decision. So far, this works perfectly fine for the standard use cases. So where the problem begins. So now in the real world application, often we have a custom authentication requirement. For example, I have a custom authentication requirement of allow only login to the user whose age is only greater than 18. Or I have also requirement of allow only login for the user which are from the any specific countries like India or US and also have a requirement of allow some custom compliance or business rules. So you might think, can I add this particular logic in the user details service? So the answer is no, because the user detail service is only responsible for loading user data. It basically does not handle authentication decision. So you cannot validate your age, your country, or some custom business rules. So the solution is to handle such scenario to create your own authentication provider implementation. This is your actual solution to implement this. So inside your authentication provider, you will have a user detail service which basically perform additional checks of your age, country, or custom business logic, and it basically decides whether the authentication is success or not. So the final flow would be like our custom provider return the authentication object, provider manager receives it, and the response goes back to the filter. So in the next lecture, we will going to deep dive into how authentication provider actually be implemented in the IntelliJ. I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you.